5.
Are Labour now closer to power?
A little teeny weeny bit, but no, I don't think so.
4.
The hate that you see among people with these entrenched identity views, I personally find incredibly depressing.
3.
Also, the fuel crisis at the moment is being used by Remain Central, and God knows there's plenty of them around, to say that it's all due to Brexit.
2.
If Waitrose runs out of Tara Masalata and hummus, will it constitute a double-dip recession?
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast that's ordinarily hosted by Alison Pearson and me, Liam Halligan. But Alison's enjoying a well-earned holiday, digging her little painted toenails into the sand. So today, I'm delighted to welcome aboard the Planet Normal rocket a most distinguished guest co-pilot, the writer, broadcaster, politician, director and founder of the Academy of Ideas, Baroness Claire Fox. Welcome.
Welcome, Liam. It's good to be here. Less of the Baroness, please, at this stage.
You still can't believe it, can you? What are you doing in the House of Lords? It's insane.
It's so mad.
It's insane.
Nobody can believe it. I can't believe it. And when people call me Lady Fox when I'm in there, I jump every time.
Now, I am just back from Labour's party conference in Brighton, and what struck me, listening to the speeches, Claire, talking to shadow ministers and other delegates, is what nearly always strikes me when I go to party conferences as a journalist, be they Labour, Conservative or whoever else. That is, they're nearly always about internal procedure, political infighting, intra-party rivalries, and true to form, Labour didn't have all that much to say at its annual gabfest to the outside world. I think some shadow ministers, given their media moment in the sun, they could have used their platform speeches to talk about the fuel crisis, which is now a very serious economy-threatening phenomenon. And given the huge lack of leadership on this from the actual government, it was an open goal, but Labour failed to put the ball in the back of the net. Having said that, co-pilot Fox, is that better than Baroness
That's
Fox?
better.
Having said that, co-pilot Fox, and I know you're a very close watcher of party politics and the Labour Party in particular, I did think there were signs of progress from Starmer. He is now taking on the left, getting rule tweaks through party conference which stymie hardliners, and in his leader speech, which we've both just listened to before recording this episode of Planet Normal, he did indeed mention the fuel situation, if only in passing. So welcome again, Claire Fox, to Planet Normal. We're delighted you're with us. What did you make of Labour's trip to the seaside?
So I agree with you completely that it was dominated by the internal stuff. There was no sort of headlines for me. But what people will talk about is probably that last leader's speech, whether he pulled it off or not. And to a certain extent, from the point of view of internal politics, he dealt with the left. So if that's what the big focus is, then that's one of the things he did. Again, the headlines aren't so clear in terms of what it really means politically. I'm not sure it's going to appeal to the voters that he wants it to. It wasn't just that it was long. It was just that it was like box ticking. I just felt like there was so many things that he just felt he had to nod to all the time that in the end it drove me mad. No, it did drive me mad because I just thought, there was the emotional bits, there was the home bits, there was the working bits, the dignity of it really was like a list, probably quite well constructed. Everybody says it was passionate, but I think it's starting from a low bar. That's because we all think of him as a technocrat who's a lawyer. And then he actually sounded a bit more human today. But that's not exactly the same as being a leader, is it?
I think there's a lot in that. I think it was too long at 88 minutes. I did think it was competent. I think Keir Starmer's Labour Party did okay at their Brighton conference. The first conference, of course, which they've had in person for a long time, given the pandemic. I thought talking to people in the bars and in the corridors down in Brighton, talking to people at fringe meetings and so on, it's clear to me that the Corbynistas, the hard left, if you like, of the party, do feel that they're being outmanoeuvred. Those arcane rule changes he got through conference, which means it's a lot harder for somebody from the hard left of the party in Parliament to become leader. I think they're key. And for me, the standout speech, though it was completely overshadowed because a Labour frontbencher who no one had ever heard of, called Andy Mcdonald, resigned as Shadow Employment Secretary because he wanted a £15 minimum wage rather than a £10 minimum wage, even though he'd previously agreed a £10 minimum wage up from the current level of £8.91. His resignation overshadowed the speech by Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor. I do think, Claire, that Rachel Reeves passes the kind of sniff test, if you like, the boardroom test. I've been talking to business leaders this morning. They do feel that there's a bit more credibility now from Labour on the economy, which of course is key. Her move to scrap business rates, the tax on rateable values of businesses, which bedevil so many small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the backbone of the economy. A lot of the leaders of those firms are swing voters, very pragmatic. They'll vote for whoever is best for their business. The fact that Labour are saying they're going to scrap business rates, I think, is a really interesting move that says, yes, they are now interested in political power.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, because the one thing that you would say was, and Keir Starmer made this clear in that interview when he said, you know, that he's not interested in just making a soundbite and going on Twitter with it, but he wanted power. And the way he dealt with hecklers the same. His emphasis on business and competence today was very much, I mean, he definitely wants to be the Prime Minister, right? And they definitely see themselves as in with a chance. What I'm asking is, though, we're in a new era, and it felt to me just like a Blairite speech with some added bits. I'm just not convinced that it had the pizzazz, if you want. And it also avoided certain elephants in the room. So first of all, we dealt with anti-Semitism by giving a standing ovation and the welcome home to Louise Ellman, right?
Yeah. We should explain that Louise Ellman is a former Labour MP who has complained about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer changed the rules again, so there's an easier complaints procedure within the Labour Party about dealing with concerns over anti-Semitism. And when Keir Starmer said, welcome home, Louise Ellman, she got a huge standing ovation. And there were tears in the eyes of some people, certainly from the camera coverage.
Honestly, that will be important for a lot of people, because it does feel as though anti-Semitism has been confronted. I didn't like the way it was done. But if you want, Louise Ellman, who is now CEO of Index on Censorship, also raises another issue of issues around, for example, free speech and cancel culture. And people might think, oh, she's always going on about this. But out there in the real world, it's not just a fuel crisis that's going on. There's also big arguments and big rows that are going on, which I think he avoided. And he avoided very strikingly dealing with the problem of the row about what a woman is. Could you believe the Labour Party would be torn on that? Dealing with the fact that one of his MPs felt frightened to turn up at the conference because she was going to be attacked as a transphobe.
That's right, Rosie Duffield,
ridiculous things, Rosie Duffield things. But none of that was dealt with. It wasn't confronted, but it doesn't go away just because you don't say it in a conference speech. And God knows he said everything else. So it can't be that he ran out of time. He consciously chose not to take that on. And then, of course, he did the taking of the knee point. And he said, we are patriots. But he said it in relation to a controversy that's been about people being called racist if they booed taking the knee. And I don't want to enter into that discussion, but I'm just making the point that there's a lot of big political issues out there in the real world that were not addressed. So competence in business is good for them. But nonetheless, it strikes me that that just ticks a box. It doesn't really deal with the fact that they're no longer the party of working people. And they're not particularly trusted, I think, on a range of issues beyond the fact that they might now sound as though they want to run the economy.
I agree with you. The fact that Keir Starmer didn't deal with this whole issue of you shouldn't say a woman is someone who has a cervix is just unbelievable. I'd say 98% of the population think this stuff is absolutely mad. But 98% of the population, the vast majority of them, of course, want people to live their lives the way they want to live their lives. They're in no way transphobic. Something I want to ask you about, Claire, was the Angela Rayner question, Labour's deputy leader, who was recorded at a fringe meeting quite early on at the conference, saying that the Tories are xenophobic, racist, scumbags, etc., not necessarily a good way to get people who previously voted Conservative to vote for you, which the Labour Party need to do. And I thought it was just ridiculous. We have a chancellor who is the son of Asian immigrants. We have a home secretary who is the daughter of Asian immigrants. We have a business secretary who is the son of Ghanaian immigrants. We have all kinds of people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds at the top or near the top of the Conservative Party. What was she going on about?
Well, I mean, people talk about this phrase dog whistle. I mean, that appeals to a certain Labour activist, right? So, and no doubt she means it as well. They really despise and hate and believe that the Tory party represent this kind of knuckle-dragging backward set of ideas. And I'm not a Conservative by any stretch, and I have major criticisms of them. But in a way, that was playing the culture war. It was just on a different side, if you see what I mean, because she was actually trying to imply that that was the heart and soul of, Boris Johnson's Conservative Party. She's slightly narrowed it down to it just being him. But as you've rightly pointed out, that means that the millions of people who voted for them must be stupid or conned or agree with those accusations. But the other thing that really, really annoyed me that I think will have played very badly and seems to have done amongst people that I've been talking to is the fact that those people who defended Angela Rayner tried to make out that this was just plain speaking, that calling people scum was just because she was Northern and she's not as refined as other people. But actually, that's really insulting and condescending, isn't it? It's got that horrible, God knows, at fringe meetings, I have been known to use a bit of hyperbole myself. It's not as though we don't understand the concept of speaking truth to power. Angela isn't unique in being able to say what she feels, but actually what she felt was pretty scummy itself. It was a kind of toxic, nasty side of political life. And then to try and say that it's because she was working class just struck me as being ridiculously insulting. And I don't think that has gone down well at all.
She's done it before. She's been reprimanded by the Speaker of the House of Commons for shouting scum from the green benches across the dispatch box. It's absolutely outrageous language. And as you say, I'm from a working class background myself. The idea that people from that background are inarticulate and incapable of expressing themselves in a way that isn't deeply offensive is completely outrageous to me.
I know. It's also so ironic because actually that kind of wing of the Labour Party, if you want, are the ones who are the most unforgiving and intolerant of ordinary people. If, for example, they chant the wrong things at a football match, which is maybe where that might be the kind of place where you'd expect a bit of fruity language. But of course, that is going to not pass any kind of test for the Labour Party. And they're the people who police language all the time. You're not allowed to say certain words. You're not allowed to say certain things. They're the ones who actually condemn ordinary people when they speak frankly, informally, in their everyday lives as being not fit for purpose. But then at a political meeting, when you maybe want to consider the way that you are taking on your political opposition and the way that you're talking about voters, it's all right to say scum. And we all know that there's been a lot of that, every Brexiteer was a gammon, all of that sort of stuff has happened. And then they say that they're the ones who are keeping politics civil. Do me a favour.
Do me a favour. Claire, you've been a strong Labour supporter over the years. You haven't always voted Labour, of course, and famously, you were part of the Brexit Party. You're a Brexit Party MEP. I didn't hear Brexit talked about very much in Brighton. There was a section of Keir Starmer's speech about Brexit in which he basically said, look, we have to make Brexit work. This from a smoothie pants lawyer who did everything he could to try to reverse Brexit, even though it was in the Labour manifesto on which he was elected, that Labour would honour the referendum result. So what I heard in the speech was a kind of grudging, the Tories are making a mess of Brexit, we're going to do Brexit better. So he's kind of accepting that Brexit is over. But what I think Keir Starmer should do is this. I think he should apologise for his stance on Brexit. I think that is actually a prerequisite of the Labour Party getting a hearing in some of these red wall, Midlands, northern seats that they desperately need to win back if they're going to have any chance of wresting power from Boris Johnson.
I absolutely agree with that last point. I think I ought to, because I can tell that the listeners will be gulping as you were speaking. I think saying that I was a strong Labour supporter would be, I was probably like in Labour circles critical from the left, right? So I don't think it would be right to imply that I was like some major Labour cheerleader. But you're absolutely right that as somebody who obviously, as on the left, would have all too glad to see the Conservatives defeated by Labour over the years, and not somebody who ever anticipated the Labour Party would end up in the state they're in and has followed it carefully. The Brexit issue was the big issue for me and for many millions of other people in terms of Labour having lost the plot, in terms of representing working people and treating them with contempt. So when you say he should have apologised, you see, that's what I meant about the elephant in another elephant in the room, which is that in some ways, he wanted to just say, well, let's do Brexit well now, let's accept it. And that's, that's a reasonable position. But it completely abdicates responsibility for the way that Labour treated those voters ever since, well, before 2016 and certainly doubled down afterwards and tried to overturn the vote. And he was part of that. And in the midst of it, absolutely traduced the reputation of Brexit voters by suggesting they were stupid, conned, xenophobic, all of those insults that were to follow. Absolutely anti-democratic positioning by many of the Labour frontbenchers, Keir Starmer being a leader.
Yeah.
To not acknowledge it, to pretend that all is forgiven. I mean, he might have forgiven himself, but I don't know anyone else has.
Yeah.
Also, the fuel crisis at the moment is being used by Remain Central, and God knows there's plenty of them around, to say that it's all due to Brexit. So he could have actually confronted it that way in a kind of, with a contemporary hook, and actually explained straight down the line that those people who are really being cheap and trying to use the fuel crisis, HGV drivers issue, to then make a kind of, we always told you Brexit was a disaster. He could have dealt with that cleverly in his very long speech, but he just didn't. He doesn't ever want to talk about Brexit because he knows that in that one, he was on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of his own voters, and the wrong side of the working class, and the wrong side of democracy.
The wrong side of democracy.
And he doesn't want anyone to talk about
Absolutely. And I was talking to various sort of Labour eggheads and strategists down in Brighton. And it's interesting you say that the speech was a Blairite speech. It was actually written by a very smart guy who we both know, who is Tony Blair's former speech writer. So there's going to be a lot more comparisons of Starmer with Blair in the weeks and months to come, I would say, as he gives more and more speeches. But something I wanted to mention to you, which I know will interest you, there's a movement, a kind of school of thought called Blue Labour. Blue Labour is the idea that Labour can formulate policies which appeal to working class people, so they're tough on crime, they're patriotic, their traditional social values and the family are put to the fore, alongside more high spending, generally left-wing economic policy. And we're going to hear from a guest later in the show who will talk about this as well. But on the fringe meeting circuit, I did hear quite a few people talking about Blue Labour and thinking that this is maybe the way Labour should go. What do you think?
Well, I think that Maurice Glassman, who's been the person most associated with Blue Labour, maybe somebody like Paul Embry as well.
So Maurice is a Labour peer, and Paul Embry is actually one of my colleagues on GB News. He presents a show on GB News. He's a former Fire Brigades union worker who has been writing some really interesting stuff about Labour Party policy, particularly on the website Unheard.
Yeah, so in fact, that's the whole thing is actually there were tones in that speech that did note that, you know, the dignity of work, his emphasis on his family and his roots and so on, had a bit of a Blue Labour tinge. And I've noticed that a variety of left-wing activists from the Labour Party have said, oh, God, he's playing that. They've actually said, you know, playing the racist card. You think, God, because they think that those kind of things are racist. It's ridiculous. But one of the things is Blue Labour is very closely associated with Brexit. So again, they won't have been satisfied. And you know, when he was going around the room sort of telling people to stand up, the parents of that terrible story of the parents of the young woman who was killed in a domestic violence incident. And it was very moving.
It was very moving.
But he was going around the room and getting people to stand up and kind of acknowledging them, Doreen Lawrence, so on and so forth. Well, you see, he could have done that with Paul Embry, couldn't he? Because Paul Embry lost his job working for the FBU, the Fire Brigades Union, because he spoke at a Leave Means Leave rally a few years ago and was absolutely turned upon by the union. Now, the sort of way that you would really make an impact was to acknowledge somebody like that, somebody not expected. I mean, no disrespect to Doreen Lawrence, but, you know, it was kind of a bit, that's what I mean about a bit box ticky. It didn't really surprise you in any way. And therefore, I think that he might want to appeal to Blue Labour sentiments, and there's a bit of that there, but you have to make that a real concrete thing, and you've got to really mean it, not just do it in order to kind of tick a box.
Paul Embry, of course, has been a guest on Planet Normal. He ended up taking the Fire Brigades Union to court, didn't he? And he won his case for unfair dismissal, and fair play to him. I think in the end, I'm not going to claim any credit if it happens, but I have been urging people around Starmer that he does need to do this mea culpa on Brexit. I mean, I kind of accept Labour conference probably isn't the place to do it. He needs a rather more controllable audience. It was interesting to see all the heckling that was going on. People weren't ejected from the conference as they have been in the past, because obviously that looks awful on television and it would lead the news if you got a sort of 60 or 70-year-old activist being dragged out of a conference by some burly bloke with sort of mirror sunglasses. Remember that guy Walter Wolfgang, who was removed from Labour Party conference, and that was a really, really bad look. He dealt with the heckles quite well, but maybe that wasn't the place to do the Labour mea culpa. But perhaps in the end it will happen. I certainly think it should happen as a prerequisite of winning back the trust of people that have voted Labour for years, just saying, yes, I know I got it wrong and I'm being a grown-up about it and acknowledging that I got it wrong, and I apologise for disrespecting your vote because I didn't think you were clever enough effectively to know what you were voting
That would
for.
have been brilliant. I just wanted to say a little bit about the hecklers, which is that they didn't want to eject the hecklers.
Yeah.
The hecklers were part of the story, part of the script. They rather liked the hecklers. And that's why it was a kind of internal thing, because those hecklers were the means by which Keir Starmer could assert that he was now in charge of the Labour Party. They were a bit they played their part very well, actors that you could laugh at and ridicule and say what mad people they are, right? And in that sense, it was a bit unsavoury because it felt like a script being played out. It doesn't mean that you've really dealt with the fact that the Labour Party is full of people who support those heckles, even if those hecklers don't represent what millions of Labour voters have previously believed.
And I think also Andy Mcdonald, the front bencher who resigned, did a similar thing as well, because he resigned because he said he wanted a £15 minimum wage. Now, I'm all for fair pay, Claire, but £15 an hour is higher as a minimum wage than the average wage in this country. It would be not quite a doubling of the minimum wage, but it would be, you're getting on the way for a doubling of the minimum wage at a time when businesses are struggling in many cases to recover from this pandemic. So the fact that you had a front bencher resigning because he wanted a £15 minimum wage and Keir Starmer effectively said, good riddance, we're going to stick with a £10 minimum wage. Hey, guess what? The minimum wage at the moment is $8.91. We've got 3-4% inflation. A £10 minimum wage is not unreasonable, I would say, as an economics person, pro-business person, Telegraph columnist and all. I think a £10 minimum wage is a reasonable level to move towards in the months ahead. And again, that made Starmer look credible, but he was able, as you say, to push against more left-wing elements in order to build his credibility.
Yeah, but it's building his credibility with a particular Labour constituency. That's the point. The question always is, he can create this new party, ridicule and marginalise the left, which I think maybe has happened. They will grouch and complain. Some of them will vote Green, some of them, and so on and so forth. What I'm talking about is whether that is going to be enough to appeal in the electoral cycle, whether it really is the makings of a new Labour Party. It's actually interesting. I can't remember who it was now, so this is a bit unhelpful, but somebody actually said that they're not so much interested in winning back those red wall seats. They're more interested in winning Tory voters, and they need to win the country and so on. In other words, what I'm saying is, what are the Labour Party? What do they represent ideologically? What is their challenge to the Conservatives? And he had some funny lines in relation to Boris Johnson. But if it's only competence, then we're back with a technocratic party that actually still is divorced from the interests, the lives of ordinary people, even things like the minimum wage. The minimum wage is, of course, an important issue, but what's really important is a productive economy, an absolute commitment to ensuring that people have fair treatment at work and so on. There's a big economic boost. Their emphasis on green jobs and the Green New Deal, whether we like it or not, is going to actually hold back that productivity, in my view. And they won't confront that. They're just not so distinguishable to me from the core of the Tory party, just personality differences between him and Boris Johnson. And then one thing we haven't mentioned is, they have to get in things like bringing in a misogyny, hate crime, things like that. These things are not popular with millions of people. It's like, what's that about?
Let me finish this part of the podcast, Claire, by asking you this question. After Brighton, are Labour now closer to power?
A little teeny weeny bit, but no, I don't think so. I'm not convinced that they are. I think Brexit still is a very big issue, as you've said. The only reason I am hesitating at all is that the Labour Party machine is formidable, and you never want to underestimate it. And also, if we were having this conversation after the Conservative Party conference, we'd have to say it's not as though they're doing well. So let's be honest, a lot of it is how the Tories fare. So by default, they're certainly more electable in a kind of respectable electoral sense. Whether they can ever be the Labour Party as they envisage themselves as representing millions of working people who Labour, as he emphasised, that bit I doubt very much. They remain to me a middle-class metropolitan party, no matter what they say.
Nigel Farage.
This is the most commonest thing done by any government in my lifetime in this country.
Lionel Shriver.
Which is worse, Biden's not being in control and Biden being in control?
Charles Moore.
I think if people in general feel that their traditions, culture, history, values, etc. are under assault, they are basically right.
My name is Stephen Edgington, and if you're enjoying this podcast, you might like Off Script, a new series from The Telegraph. Provocative conversations with provocative individuals. Each episode I sit down with a world-leading commentator to unpick the ongoing culture wars. Unfiltered, unscripted, and full of free speech. Be sure to listen to Off Script in the same place you're listening to this, and make sure to follow so you don't miss an episode.
Now, we've had all kinds of stowaway guests on the Planet Normal rocket, from politicians to business leaders, soul singers to celebrity chefs. But it's not often we invite another journalist to join us on Planet Normal. Today, though, we're making an exception and talking to Robert Peston. Robert's the political editor of ITV, of course, having previously been both economics editor and business editor of the BBC, and before that, a print journalist on the Financial Times, where I worked alongside him when he was political editor back in the late 1990s. Well, the Pest, as he's affectionately known across Fleet Street, has now turned his hand to writing fiction. His new novel, The Whistleblower, is indeed set in the late 1990s, and the lead character is the hard-driving, news-obsessed political editor of a paper called The Financial Chronicle, amidst a change of government as Labour wins a landslide election. It's a tale about journalism, but about intrigue, corruption and power. And I started by asking Robert Peston, tongue-in-cheek, if any aspects of his new novel were autobiographical.
Not in the slightest, Liam, he says disingenuously. I mean, obviously, when I was writing this thriller, I, drew on a lot of things I lived through. And so all the characters in it are sort of based on people I've observed, and the central character, Gil Peck, there is a bit of that character that is me, but also there are other things that he does or other things about the way he behaves, which are not me, they're about some other people I've observed. So it's not a sort of old-fashioned roman à clé in the sense you're not supposed to read it and think, oh, well, this person is that Labour leader or that Labour shadow chancellor. You're supposed to read it and think, gosh, I hope I've captured the spirit of the times. It was a sort of frenetic time, actually, I think for many people, a time of hope for change. But the characters in it, I hope, are sort of authentic without being sort of an attempt at caricatures of real people. They're all amalgams.
I think it is very authentic and also, for me personally, nostalgic. I mean, I should say to listeners, during that time you were the political editor of Financial Times, I sat next to you for a number of years. You taught me to become a reporter. And I think Planet Normal listeners will enjoy the book, The Whistleblower by Robert Peston. It features so many themes, power, money, corruption, absolutely. But what really shines through from this book is the passion that you have, your central character has, for breaking stories, for journalism. And I think more than anything else, this book is about your passion for writing stories that sometimes no one else wants to write. Where does that come from?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've often wondered why I have so little respect for authority. But I've wondered whether there was something about how I grew up, something to do with my family. But it is true that in a very childish way, pretty much all my professional career, I have sort of got a kick out of, writing stuff or broadcasting stuff that I knew was going to upset quite a lot of people and quite often, and particularly powerful people. And I don't know, maybe it's because my dad was he was a lovely man.
Boris Peston, a leading economist of the 60s, 70s, 80s, advisor to Harold Wilson. He wrote one of the textbooks that I used at university.
And he, some people would have described him as, as a sort of great man. But he was just my dad. And, he could be an utter pain about, doing maths homework with him was an absolute nightmare. But maybe it's because I sort of grew up with somebody who was sort of revered by lots of people that, in some way I had a sort of need to prick other people's bubbles or something. I don't know. I'm trying to do some cod psychology on myself now. But there is a slight paradox, actually, which is in the last few years, I have actually been quite saddened by the sort of cynicism that you see around the place for whether it's politicians or leaders of various institutions, many of whom do believe in public service and are actually doing their jobs for what we would think of as the right reasons. And yet we sort of live in an era where nobody really trusts that somebody who's got power isn't doing it for some awful ulterior motive. We live in a very cynical age. And I slightly hope that I haven't contributed to that. I mean, in all my journalism, what I've wanted to do is not undermine individuals for no reason at all, but because I do think it's very important. I think the role that you and I fill as the so-called fourth estate of holding power to account is a vital underpinning of a healthy democracy. What I don't like is gratuitous, nasty, misleading journalism. I hope that neither you or I ever engage in that. But I have always wanted to write about it in terms of fiction. And I'm not going to name a particular individual, but there have been one or two people, particularly in business, where you just look into their eyes and you think about the kind of threatening things they're saying, and you think these people are capable of murder.
It's interesting you mentioned business. Your journalistic roots are in business journalism. You are one of those rare journalists who can actually read a balance sheet and get a handle on a company. You've then marauded from business journalism across political journalism, print to broadcast. Now you're going from non-fiction to fiction. Did you hesitate at all before you decided to put your pen to paper to write a novel?
I hesitated for about 10 seconds. It was last summer that I started. And it was just because, I just felt like many of us slightly, frustrated, semi-imprisoned by COVID and lockdown. And I just wanted to do something a bit different. I had all my life actually thought about writing fiction, but I sat down and actually, I don't know if you've ever tried to write fiction, Liam, but I just loved it because actually it's sort of liberating because it's all made up. You can write what you like. And I can't do that. I've written 4 non-fiction books. I've been in serious journalism for decades. You can't do that with non-fiction and journalism.
If we think back to the mid-late 90s, that incredible time in British politics, okay, we were a lot younger then, so we're going to look back with rose-tinted spectacles, if you like, anyway. But isn't British politics different now? Isn't it more vituperative? Isn't there more cynicism knocking around, particularly among our profession?
I think there's more cynicism everywhere. I think actually, if I'm honest with you, the media has always had you can go back actually to the 19th century, and whether it's the pamphleteers or the slightly more established media, there's always been a cynicism in the Fourth Estate, and that's actually a good thing. A good journalist does not get too close to the individuals they're reporting on, whether they're politicians or business people. You've got to have the ability to stand back and judge these people objectively. But there is just a general nastiness around in our culture at the moment that I really lament and is very different, I think, from the late 90s. And I think starts to come in, 10, 15 years ago. And I'm actually slightly obsessed with this at the moment because, I'm thinking about, I'm starting to write a sort of non-fiction book which looks at some of these issues of what we think of as the culture wars and identity politics, which I hate. And one of the reasons, actually, that I set the book in 97 is because I do think that some of what has gone wrong, some of what has corroded our politics did actually start in the mid to late 90s. And I know this sounds slightly paradoxical, but I do fear that the unbelievably successful electoral strategy of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, which was to say that actually the old class-based way that people chose who to vote for, right? Working class Labour, sort of upper middle class, proper upper class Tory, and then there's a sort of bunch in the middle of middle class, some sort of university kind of educated people, might be more Labour, a certain kind of intellectual sort. But basically we had a class-based politics and people defined themselves in a sort of socio-economic way. And Blair did this brilliant thing, and it won him 3 elections, of saying, actually, we're all reasonable people. You don't have to make tough choices to tax the rich in order to have a welfare state that you want. We can all muddle along together. We can grow the economy fast. That'll produce the revenues, and we can all get better off. Now, first of all, the financial crash rather indicated that there was a degree of naivety around that view. But secondly, I also think it meant that, particularly among the white working classes in what we now think of as the blue wall that used to be the red wall in the Midlands and North, I think a lot of those people felt abandoned by their party. It's not completely dissimilar to what happened with the industrial Rust Belt in America and the Democrats, right? And actually, let's be clear, Osborne and Cameron sort of learned those lessons and did more or less the same thing to the Tory party, and it confused people. And they felt, okay, it's now much harder for me to define myself by my political allegiances and my socioeconomic status. So what are you going to define yourself by? You're going to define yourself by your ethnicity or by your faith or by your gender or by your sexuality, or nationality, Scottish nationalism, English nationalism, all of that. Now, while I think these are all, legitimate parts of our makeup, well, I don't think it's so healthy for political debate when they become the defining part of your makeup, because when they become the defining part of your makeup, what we've discovered is, let's take the trans debate, people on either side of that feeling incapable of talking to each other in a reasonable way.
Any kind of compromise. There's just entrenched positions screaming at each other.
Compromise goes out the window. And actually I personally take the view that the old passions, which were much more based on a sort of political vision of society was sort of healthier. Because even if you could disagree really emotionally, if you were Labour with a Tory or Tory with a Labour, you could still go down the pub afterwards and have a conversation about the other things that matter in your life. And now you feel, the hate that you see among people with these entrenched identity views, I personally find incredibly depressing, and I think they have damaged our politics. And one final point on all this, I do think social media is partly to blame for this. It's become this outlet for all these terrible emotional outpourings.
Traditional media too, as well. No?
Well, traditional media, I think, has sort of, because traditional media, whose economic model was so undermined by the rise of digital, has been struggling to find a role. And I think that it is true that some of the traditional media has now climbed on that social media.
Clickbait, as they say. They've gone after the clicks, the digital engagement.
So we've got to get back somehow to that idea, and it is a bit of a cliche, but I sort of, it matters to me, as I'm sure it does to you, that, fundamentally we all have more in common than we do that divides us. And we've got to start to recognise that again and, capture those things that bind us. I mean, for what it's worth, I was quite moved by the way that Gareth Southgate, frankly, I thought captured that. And he managed to rise above a kind of English nationalism. And one of the things that's, you may have picked up, but I'm, talking to some members of the SNP about this. And they were joking that, they'd been talking to some fellow Scots and they'd been joking around, well, presumably you'll be hoping Scotland, England loses, as usual. And actually, these people said, well, actually, we quite like Gareth Southgate. Yeah. Actually, we might be supporting England this time. And, this is not to say it's going to translate into, massive diminishing support for the SNP or anything, but it shows you that there is a language which can unite us in ways that we might currently be pessimistic about.
Now, I know from sitting next to you professionally, but also from knowing you for decades now, you are very much from a Labour background, but you are absolutely professional in terms of...
I try and be scrupulously impartial.
And you absolutely are.
And I hate it when people think they know how I vote or how I support. And over the years, just to be absolutely clear, I've had terrible relations with, those who lead and advise every party under the sun. So
one of my sort of early experiences in journalism was you, and you had one very, very senior member of the Labour cabinet on one phone and one very, very senior member of the Labour cabinet on the other, and you were literally arbitrating between them before you wrote a story that absolutely was very critical of both of them. But we are at Labour conference. Neither of us are up and down political journalists. We've both been members of the lobby. You are now a member of the lobby. You have a very senior role as political editor of ITV News. But I do think we're both outsiders to political journalism. Let me ask you, Robert, how do you think the Labour Party's doing? I think there's a bit of a sea change going on here. I think that announcement that Labour would scrap business rates is quite a big story. I think a lot of the small and medium-sized business owners across England and the UK will think that sounds very interesting. I do think the Corbynistas are being outmanoeuvred. I'm not sure that Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister, but I do think Labour here in Brighton in 2021 is showing signs, at least, that it wants power again.
Oh, God, there's absolutely no question that Starmer is desperate for power. And there is a slight paradox, which is, sorry, so preface by saying you always seem to me to be a very nice man, but I have to say, I haven't rarely encountered anybody quite as ambitious as Keir Starmer. I mean, let's just focus just for 1 second on the fact that he's only been in Parliament since 2015.
It's astonishing.
And he's been leader of the Labour Party for 18 months, right? I mean, it is astonishing. And most people who did his previous job, Director of Public Prosecutions, they go off and, they're master of an Oxford College or something. They go into sort of grand semi-retirement. And in his view, he was only just beginning, right? He is desperate to be Prime Minister. Now, you are right that right now you would say the odds are somewhat stacked against him, given what an appalling setback Labour had in that, 2019 general election before he took over. But he has here been absolutely ruthless in marginalising the Corbynista left. I do think actually people got slightly misled by the fact that he didn't change the method for electing the leader away from one member, one vote over to the Electoral College into completely underestimating the changes he has got through. I mean, increasing the trigger ballot to 50% for sitting Labour MPs makes it almost impossible now for the left to get rid of those MPs. It makes them way more, this is the first Labour conference for 5 years where it's actually been worth my while talking to Labour MPs because previously under Corbyn, they were so marginalised and there was this sort of alliance between Corbyn and the members who largely hated the MPs to humiliate those MPs, that the only reason you talk to Labour MPs was to hear their despair. Whereas now they feel they're back in charge. They've got their party back. Equally, this change that in order to get on the final ballot for election, you have to get the support of 20% of Labour MPs. Again, I think it makes it almost impossible for a left-wing candidate to, emerge who could subsequently win an election. We can go into the detail of that, but I do think actually broadly it makes it almost impossible for that to happen. So in terms of modernising the Labour Party, he's done a very important thing. I mean, I'm not sure, or modernising is probably the wrong way of putting it, reforming the Labour Party so that he is basically in control. I think he's achieved that. He's also got some very big unions on side. So when he was getting those votes through conference, he got them through fairly handsomely because he got, unisons like Unison huge, on side. But he's not yet, I think, found a way to reach out to the public. And, there are some of his colleagues who think that he's just not quite instinctive enough or emotional enough to do that. But then separately, some of the policy changes are genuinely important, right? So abolishing business rates does appeal to a group of people who would be thinking more than twice about voting Labour for the last few years, small business people who will be much more attracted. And then there is, I think, a really interesting debate going on. People think of Keir Starmer as this great metropolitan liberal. But you've probably come across this idea of blue Labour.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Broadly, more pro-business, but not, frankly, as socially liberal as the party has been in recent years. And I just get the feeling that this is a party that is moving in that sort of blue Labour direction. And the interesting calculation they've got to make is that may well help them to pick up some of those lost votes in the North and Midlands. And they would probably calculate, and this may be reasonable, that the very liberal university-educated younger people, many of whom became Momentum and Corbynistas, but some of them are just sort of sympathetic to those views, will in the end vote Labour because the alternative is so much worse, and that they can, in a sense, take those people, rather more for granted. We'll see. But I do think there's a shift in that direction. And, it doesn't mean to say that at the moment you can put a lot of money on Labour, even coming all that close in the next election. But I would say, and I'm sure this is very much on your mind, we are facing a massive surge in the cost of living. The government has done a couple of things: the national insurance rise, the removal of the universal credit uplift. This is going to damage the living standards of those on middle to low incomes. If politics followed its normal trends, then the Labour Party come next spring ought to have a healthy lead over the Tories. Now, if come next spring Labour don't have that healthy lead, then something really fundamental has happened to our politics, which I don't properly understand yet. And secondly, I would say Keir Starmer is probably a fairly short-dated stock. So he has got 6 months to prove himself.
Robert Peston, author of thousands of newspaper articles, many non-fiction books, but now also The Whistleblower. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining us on Planet Normal.
Listen, it's been a pleasure, Liam. Thank you so much for having me.
Interesting, I thought, Claire, that Robert Peston also mentioned blue Labour as a possible direction in which Keir Starmer may eventually take the party.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that interview, by the way. I'm not always a fan of all of Robert's work, but it made me want to read the novel for a start off, and it was really interesting on the state of journalism. The point about the Blue Labour issue actually refers to something else that he talked about very eloquently, which was the whole issue around identity politics and what's changed. And I think that actually some of the Blue Labour trends have been very good on those, taking up, challenging the divisive nature of identity politics. I heard nothing, however, from Keir Starmer that was prepared to do that. In fact, if anything, he played the usual identity politics tropes in his speech. So that's the contradiction that I was trying to refer to earlier. The only thing I didn't agree with Robert on was he explained it as though it was kind of understandable why people would choose to emphasise their identity. But actually, this is much more institutional these days. People are encouraged to view themselves through their ethnicity, their cultural backgrounds, their sexuality and so on, in order to gain a certain kudos as, you know, people with protected characteristics who need to be looked after. And there's a real kind of competition between different victim groups. It's a really apolitical and personalised. They don't see it as you challenging their ideas. They think you're challenging them personally. But what did we hear from Keir Starmer? He didn't take that cause up at all. So you can't just hint at Blue Labour style without dealing with the substance of what the big political issues are today, I think.
And talking of ideas, Claire, we should mention the Battle of Ideas.
Thank you for mentioning it. Yes, in just over a week, in fact, 9th and 10th of October, there's a kind of people's takeover of Westminster at Church House, which the Academy of Ideas, which I run, put on a big festival. And it's great to be back, having had to suffer the indignity of having to cancel it 2 or 3 times during the lockdown period. We've got over 70 panel debates, hundreds of speakers, and we hope thousands of attendees. And it's one of those festivals or conferences or whatever you want to call it, where half the time is given over to the audience. So it's very much not a come and listen to the experts. Although, Liam, you are speaking, and I don't want to undermine your expertise.
I was going to say.
You are merely there as speakers to kickstart a public conversation. And you know, we've been reflecting on the Labour Party conference. One thing that they also didn't challenge was the last 18, 20 months of COVID, right? Your podcast dealt with it really well, but there's still fights to be had, you know. The Tories are talking about COVID passports. There's all of the backlog in terms of the health service. These things need to be dug deep into, and we will be doing that as well as discussing identity politics, Blue Labour, the future of politics in general, green politics and why they're so likely to lead to austerity. All of these things do come along.
It's kind of you, Claire, and I know it will mean a lot to Alison. It means a lot to me that you've praised our coverage during the COVID pandemic here on Planet Normal. We really appreciate that. Thank you.
It's been invaluable. We needed these voices.
Now, on to our listener emails, a selection of the wonderful, insightful, often very funny, sometimes heartbreaking messages you send each week to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We love hearing from you. Claire, tell me about one that caught your eye.
Right, this one's from Carolyn. Carolyn says, at one point I was emailing you every week, but more recently, despite considering myself to be articulate, I would have found it impossible to send you a missive that didn't match Keir Starmer's 12,000-word essay in length. God, that was before she heard the speech as well. Anyway, immigration, Extinction Rebellion and its offshoots, the NHS, the police, taxes, shortages, HS2, where does one begin and end? Suffice to say, Boris Johnson must be the weakest Prime Minister this country has ever had. It's no good being intellectual if there's no common sense or knowledge of the real world to go with it. Saying one thing one day and contradicting it the next, never admitting he's got anything wrong and doing what he's told by all the wrong people he calls advisors is absolutely no way to run a country. I apologise sincerely to all those suffragettes who fought so hard to allow me to vote, but after nearly 60 years of dutifully putting my cross on the voting paper, I'm unlikely to do so in the future unless a common sense party is formed, headed by some of your sensible, right-thinking guests, for example, Sir Graham Brady, Sunetra Gupta and Richard Tice. My best wishes to you both, Carolyn.
That's a very common sentiment, Claire, among our Planet Normal listeners. Carolyn speaks for a lot of our listeners when she writes that. This is an email from Adam. Dear Planet Normal, over the last few weeks, you've highlighted the frustrations and difficulties people are experiencing accessing medical services. We certainly have. Whilst I entirely agree with the point you're making and indeed have personal experience of this, I think the following post at my local GP surgery, for what it's worth, one I think of the better ones on this issue, put on Facebook this week. Our reception team have been suffering a huge amount of abuse from patients contacting the practice lately, particularly today due to an issue which is beyond our control. This in turn affects you being able to get through to us because our staff have been left in tears and unable to answer the phone for the next patient. Please be mindful of this when you speak to our team. Social media is fueling the negativity by stating we are closed, which is simply not true. We're seeing an enormous amount of patients face-to-face, but we also have to make sure in a health setting we have social distancing for the waiting room and other areas in the surgery. We are patients too. Please be kind to our team. Of course, it's unlikely a significant proportion of your readers or listeners would behave in this way, says Adam. But I think, nevertheless, it might be worth you highlighting that whatever the frustrations experienced, this sort of thing is not on. Receptionists have been given a job to do. You or I may not agree with the guidelines they've been given or even the way they're interpreting those guidelines, but there are proper channels with which to express that frustration. Personal abuse should never be acceptable. Adam, we fully endorse your message. Myself, Alison, the whole Planet Normal team, and we thank you for it.
And this one's from Richard. Doctors who don't doctor, teachers who don't teach, motorways M25 that don't motor, boilers that don't boil no gas, wind farms without wind, shelves without stock, HGVs without drivers, borders sans control, and politicians who tell us that it's world-beating, bespoke or a great deal for Britain. This country is in a big mess. Oh, I quite like it. It's almost a poem, that, Richard. I like that.
This one's from John. Good morning. As you two are so excellent at explaining a mad world, perhaps you could ease my despair by explaining why the British Medical Association thinks doctors should have privileged access to fuel so they can sit in their lounges not seeing patients. Thank you for your sanity, David.
This one's from Eddie. I nearly fell off my chair when I heard you discussing the economy in depth at long last. Personally, I feel we've a wastrel running the country, and even worse, one who believes that the wind will replace fossil fuels for most of our energy. To me, he seems to be someone who's clowned about during lessons, copied his homework, and is suddenly faced with an exam paper, the reality. Image and spin seems to be our politicians' stock in trade these days, and most seem unsuitable for the dark days ahead. Regards, Eddie.
And one last to finish from me, from Tim. If Waitrose runs out of tarama salata and hummus, will it constitute a double-dip recession? Thank you for making a show that leaves me entertained and despondent in equal measure. Well done, Tim. I like that one. In fact, Tim, I'm going to unilaterally decide you are the winner of a Planet Normal mug, because that is the email of the week. It made me laugh. Claire Fox is cackling in the background there. So that's worth a Planet Normal mug as far as I'm concerned. And that's it from Planet Normal. Thank you so much again to our incredible guest co-pilot, Claire Fox, Baroness Claire Fox. Thank you so much for joining us, Claire. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It really helps others find us. That's it for this week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Thanks as ever to our producers Louisa Wells, Isabel Bajard, Elliot Lampitt, our editor Theodora Laludis. Stay safe and stay in touch with us and with each other. Alison will be back next week, and until then it's goodbye from me and it's goodbye from
Claire.